You don't want it all on your, that's a lot of file space.
Exactly. Well, Richard Carpiano, we've had a couple of conversations in the past. You've joined me on my podcast, This Is What I'm Saying, and we decided to take it to video. And so thank you for joining me again for another, I think, timely conversation. I don't think we're going to be short on discussions with your expertise for a very long time, which I think is a good thing. We need you and your colleagues and your discipline in the mix. There's a lot of really challenging problems that we face that need solutions, and they're complex, to say the least. So, just for context, you are a professor of public policy and sociology at UC Riverside, and you have some expertise to me that's really interesting. And I think some of your expertise really does apply to, we need people like you in the mix to help create some solutions, immediate and then I think long term. So, would you talk a little bit about your specific areas of expertise? And then where applicable, if there's any nationwide or statewide boards or think tanks that you're serving on where we can have some hope that people like you are involved in helping move forward some policy to help sort of get things, get the world a little bit better for some of the people who desperately need to be thought of that have not been represented up until this point.
Yeah, sure. Well, first off, thanks so much for having me back. It's wonderful, and you're right. We never have any shortage of things that we chat about. So it's good. We record this kind of stuff too. So this is great. Yeah. So I'm a bit of a hybrid animal. I'm a public health scientist who also has who combined his degree in sociology as well. And so I really approach social science. I bring social science lenses, methods, and approaches to public health problems. There's a lot of where my background is and the type of work that I do. And most of my career, I focused very heavily on how social conditions place people at risk for different types of health outcomes, different populations, locations. So that could be things like income and education and economic security, race and ethnicity, as well as things like communities and community conditions, and how the environments in which we live in, the social conditions and the environments that we're part of, really do also have lots of impacts on our health and our behaviors, even not just the health outcomes that we see. So I've studied this across my career in a number of different topics and populations, from general public to children to women's health to even looking at let's see, I'm trying to think of all the other different groups, immigrants, gay men in New York City, you name
I
it.
can help you.
So
Yes, you have.
yeah, you don't
you've
need, I was
researched.
going to say, oh my goodness, it's kind of bad when someone has to give me
Oh,
cues on all that stuff right now. What a long trip it's been. Also, I guess I realize I'm getting older, and that I now have to there's a longer trail behind me to recall.
I think
But
you've
in more
just
recent,
done a lot is the thing. And actually
yes.
you also, PS, this is interesting too. You also have researched life expectancy and mortality risk among high status individuals such as Emmy nominated actors, Major League Baseball Hall of Fame nominated players, and US presidential and vice presidential candidates.
Yeah, they provided a really nice case study, or what we would say in my business is an empirical case, to test some theories around status and about awards and how status boosts might be advantageous for health, or in some cases disadvantageous. And so there was been some
Fascinating.
yeah, controversial, I shouldn't say controversial, provocative types of theories that were
Sure.
been kind of put forth, and we were able to use that for that. But so amidst all that, in more recent years, I moved into the area of vaccines, or vaccinations, really, and people's reactions around vaccines, vaccine hesitancy, and really broader issues around vaccination hesitancy, policy. I still do the other stuff, but this has become a much more sort of pronounced, I would say, sort of substantive area of which I've been very interested in. And what I found was, so I got into it kind of staring out the window and spending a little too much time on Twitter, procrastinating, trying to think up. I was on sabbatical a number of years back, and trying to think up. I realized I was getting a little bored, and I wanted something to kind of get into something new. And it was right when the Disneyland measles outbreak occurred.
So
And
that's 2015, 2016, right? The
yeah,
outbreak, I think it was around that time.
right, exactly, yeah. And so I realized, I got more and more kind of at the time, I just thought I was procrastinating, and I realized I was getting more and more hooked into and engaged in thinking about some of the stories that were coming up, and that were very much from a standpoint of a very classic sort of public health angle in terms of thinking about infectious disease, thinking about sort of herd immunity, and not as much thinking about the social elements that really do exist around. I mean, vaccinations are a social problem, in a way. When we think about, at least I shouldn't say, not in and of themselves a problem. They've created social problems for us, and we have to think about them as sociological issues in terms of how they really get at the heart of how people think about themselves and think about risk and think about their themselves vis-a-vis or relative to their community, how we think about children and protecting them, protecting adults. And so there's so many different social science issues that are really just doing the pure kind of infectious disease epidemiology that it's really important. We need that. Just doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't help us to think through sort of the most effective ways to do education, do outreach, and other types of interventions, create policies and laws around it even, and thinking about the response to that. But to make a long story short, over time, some of that might be a sort of a natural sort of progression from the stuff that I was doing before, where I found that this has really pulled me into, and I've been really fascinated with, is studying the anti-vaccine movement itself. Often we talk about anti-vax and anti-vaccine as, kind of this broad brush kind of pejorative. Really, it's a bad sort of stigmatizing word now in the way that it gets kind of used, but that's dangerous because we know that hesitancy is a spectrum, and there are people out there, many people out there, the majority of people who would qualify as some sort of level of vaccine hesitant. They just have some sort of concerns, some sorts of questions. Maybe they might hold off on things. Maybe they might mix and match certain vaccines for their children or for themselves, or people that might be absolutely none of this. It's all bad. You can think about that as on the other end of the spectrum. We need to not paint them all with the same broad brush. And so I guess when I say the word, to be clear, when I say the word anti-vaccine, I'm usually referring to people that are very small, very vocal, very politically active minority on the extreme end of the spectrum. The rest I would classify as vaccine hesitant. Many of those people sit down with a healthcare provider and they get their questions answered. People are parents, they're concerned, they've got questions, they see things online. It's totally understandable. And even in the absence of stuff online, if you have questions about for your kid or for yourself, that's good. We want, those are the questions that should be asked. And so we should be encouraging that. And we shouldn't, it shouldn't paint them in the same a category as the extremists who are pushing disinformation and pushing for policies that are really undermining public health and undermining our safety.
And you brought something up that I think is important, and it's this. there is no one more concerned in the world than a new parent or new parents. they are afraid, am I going to drop you when I'm bathing you? I mean, I was terrified, and I kept looking around going, so you don't really go anywhere? Like, you're home with me always? I mean, you're relying on me to live? We're all in trouble. And so it is important that parents have a seat at the table with their physicians, and it is important that they ask questions. You're trying to make the best, most responsible decision for your child, for their health. And I've seen so much shaming of people who are, and again, that category of vaccine hesitant, where, well, maybe I should spread them out, or maybe people who feel afraid. And look, at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that the online environment of misinformation and the spreading of it is a huge problem. We're going to talk a little bit more about how that's impacted now the riots at the Capitol. And frankly, what's interesting about this is that there were some anti-vaccine advocates who were part of that insurgency on the Capitol, right? So let's talk about who they are, because that to your point, Dr. Carpiano, this is the more, and when we say fringe, we mean that these are folks who operate on the outside of what we would say is the normal over here on the left or over here on the right, or conservative or liberal, however you want to say that. They're really out here.
Right.
These are people who we have shown have a propensity to demonstrate violence, as we have had public health directors across the United States, let alone the state of California, who have actually had to resign because they were unsafe. Their families were being threatened, they were being threatened, and had to resign. So when we see any organization that is fueled by violence, by radical behavior, by radicalized thoughts, that's dangerous. And there happen to be part of them who are specifically focused on anti-vaccine messages. But then
Yes.
there's a lot of other folks who have other things that they are also radicalized against. So,
Yes.
and right now, ironically, and as you know, I was a vocal advocate, pro-vaccine advocate. I still am. I volunteer through Vaccinate California.
Good
Found
for you.
her
That's great.
online and was really excited, called up and said, how can I help? And that's when I learned about, Dr. Pan's bill and got really excited to be a mom of a kid who, I believe in vaccines and I think it's important to get those messages out. So that being said, we ironically now, vaccines are going to save the world. I mean, what an interesting time, right? Is that I think that more and more people, which I'm heartened about, I think more and more people now are going to look at vaccines as, well, wait a minute. I mean, if our economies are shut down, we lost our jobs, lack of access to healthcare, and vaccines could get us back to life, I think we're going to see, I believe we are going to see more people, especially with the new administration, that are going to start to look at vaccines as, wow, this is going to be important. We'll see what happens during that rollout. But in the meantime, what I'd love to ask you about, because this is a study that you've spent quite a bit of time on, is vaccine hesitant parents. We do feel for, we're empathic towards, we understand this is tricky. We're working hard on messaging so that people can understand that they are safe. And while acknowledging, yes, some people have had, negative results from getting a vaccine. If your arm is sore, that's not a vaccine injury, and helping people understand more about that. But can you help pull that into some of the more recent things that we've seen happen, which has been this outburst of violent behavior? And again, I'm not going to compare 9/11 to the insurgency on our nation's capital. The only thing that I will compare, at least from my experience, Richard, is that when I watched it live, I happened to have the national news on. I happened to be working on my computer, and I looked up, and I had that same response of what is happening, where I had
Yeah.
those moments of
The what the hell
disbelief,
moment.
and then I had to sit and put everything down and go, wait, are people actually breaking in? Right? It was that same moment, and then the horrors of watching a Confederate flag and people sitting in Nancy Pelosi's office. So, but there were a lot of different sort of factions of people that joined the violent part. Yes, there were people who were standing outside who never had anything to do with the violence. But my goodness, we did have people, and we've already identified some of them with the FBI. We did have a strong, or we're going to say anti-vax, whatever people want to call it, but violence. And we had different groups.
Yes.
Can you, again, through your expertise, your eyes, walk me through what was your response when you saw this? When did you see it? Did you see it live? Did somebody have to tell you? And then as you've been watching this unfold and the different groups the FBI is identifying, I'd love to hear your perspective on all of that.
Yeah. So I guess I'll take the personal reaction question first and say that was I was watching it in real time as well, and I was in New York during 9/11, and I'll admit that's a very salient life event for me, and so yeah, that certainly was a reference point in evaluating what's going on
Wow.
here,
Okay.
and that
Okay.
sort of surreal. Um, I wasn't anywhere near the towers or anything like that, but I remember just being in the city when things got locked down, trying to figure out what was happening, looking at the television, even just when I remember the first plane hit the tower there, and that just even seemed, at that point, yeah, I was walking through the train station and thinking, oh well, it was probably a small plane, it was an accident,
Right.
things were bound to happen. I was far away from the TV, and then realizing later on the significance of and it was just so surreal. And so watching this, very much that sort of similar reaction to that, um, sort of disbelief that I admit, just sort of these things we take for granted. I just would always figure that the Capitol was a pretty well guarded, secure kind of place too. And to now hear the news that they were within, just a minute or so of seeing the vice president
That's right.
and other members of, members of Senate and House too. So, I guess just the Senate that day. But yeah, so I mean, certainly very, it just surreal to sit and stare. And I remember that having to, I kind of laugh as a kind of a coping mechanism with it, but having to then go in after all that and then teach that evening. And I sent a note to my students. I didn't acknowledge it, and I realized afterwards, it bothered me that I didn't with my students. I just felt like I just needed to sort of put my stiff upper lip and just kind of go in. And today we're going to cover topic X, and this is the thing. And I was kind of so, I guess, focused on me keeping it together, but not really thinking about how how my students were. And so I sent them a note after that, sort of just I just let it all out. I just said, look, I don't really know how to. I said, it seems like, universities send out a lot of these, like in these unprecedented times kind of notes, after the George Floyd killing,
Right.
other sorts of events happening. Um, I said, and I said, I want you to know I'm here for you. I said, but I said, I don't really know how to write these things. I said, this is the things you don't
Yeah.
learn in professor school. And, and I just kind of laid it all out there. Said, here's my experience. Here's how I think about these things. I probably should have brought this up more, and I apologize, but here's how I process these things. My students, I got this like outpouring of these like multiple paragraph notes of appreciation and
Oh,
everything else.
that's
I mean,
wonderful.
I don't mean that sounds a little sort of
No, it
self-aggrandizing. I don't
doesn't.
mean it
No,
that
it
way,
doesn't.
but to me at least gave me to them like appreciation that even that other people
Right.
were experiencing the same thing that they were, and they were like,
Right.
we totally get it if you didn't bring it up or whatever kind of thing, but yeah, I share totally the same, this kind of shock and horror. and
Yeah. Yeah.
and they're and they're younger and have less life experience about these things too. So anyway,
Right.
so for what that was worth, that was sort of my personal experience, watching these events unfold on TV. Related to the anti-vaccine movement, really we see this as sort of the unfortunate sort of evolution of the anti-vaccine movement. So right at so let's go back. I won't make this too long a historical narrative, but if we go back to January of 2020, right before the pandemic started to become news, and we really saw a number of instances of where the anti-vaccine movement was kind of going or where it couldn't go, in the sense that they were at that point from about the fall, you could say at least from the fall onward, the fall of 2019 to early 2020, there were several state bills that were proposed in California, in New Jersey, in Connecticut. I believe there was some elsewhere. New York had passed something relatively easily that had tried to address philosophical exemptions, eliminating them. And personal belief exemptions, to make it just about that it has to be a medical reason for not having your child vaccinated to attend school, to attend public.
And the reason, right. And just, I mean, you're welcome to continue on that thread, but I just wanted for context, the reason that we saw legislative efforts show up across the United States in various states is because we were seeing that vaccination rates were dropping. And in
Yes,
some counties, and certainly school districts, they were dropping to dangerous levels where
yes,
if we had a child who came to a school who perhaps did contract the measles, because if you're not vaccinating your child, I mean,
yeah.
Disneyland, that measles outbreak from that one child hit 257 or more people.
Mhm.
So if your vaccination levels drop, and there's a vaccine preventable disease that absolutely can be lethal, um, there was a warning signs going off saying this
Yes.
isn't safe. This is a public
Yes.
health crisis. And so we need to do something to address that. So thanks. I just wanted to put a pin on sort of why this was happening.
Yeah, and an additional quick context on that also is this was not just sort of big bad government wanting to just start to make more rules about things. It was also in response to the fact that we had a particularly bad measles year
That's right.
prior to that as well, and also the recognition, at least in California, that the prior bill had some holes in it that needed to be
Yeah.
patched up. So I guess one of the big rules of public policy is when you put policies into place, people will always to find ways to get around them.
Right.
And so there were some things built into that. So there wasn't, after that bill got, after it passed in California, after a whole bunch of, really the state house became quite a circus in terms of the anti-vax activists showing up and just flooding the hallways and trying to lock doors. And there was the I think there was, I forget if they ever confirmed it or not, but potential menstrual blood thrown onto the Senate
Oh, it
floor.
was confirmed. It was
Was
confirmed.
confirmed.
And of
Okay.
course that story didn't just go
Person was arrested.
national.
Yeah.
Yep. But that story
Senator
went,
Pan was assaulted
that's
in
right.
the lead up to the bill. A number of different groups that showed up there. Anyway, so once that their efforts failed, It moved on to some other states. New Jersey, they were a bit successful in unhinging it. I also do think, though, that also had to do with the fact that the bill was not written very well.
Yeah,
I think so
agree.
that had some problems too. But anyway, so this left. They were already sort of now moving into this politics realm and talk. It was a lot. It wasn't just suddenly. This had been sort of a slow progression, but very much about values and about health freedom. And so a very kind of libertarian, what I call libertarian-ish kind of viewpoint of I should be able to do kind of whatever I want to my body and I'm free, even though a lot of these things refer to their kids. But we
Right.
see also a very common discourse over kind of almost implying like a child is my property and the state should stay out of things. And we know
Yes.
that that doesn't hold. You abuse your child, the state's going to step in. It's a
Right.
very tentative
Right.
social contract. So anyhow, so this stuff was already sort of occurring. And so the question then kind of became of, what next, at least especially in California, what really next for the anti-vaccine movement? And I will fully admit, so, COVID starts to occur and I see people saying, hey, I wonder if, this is kind of the big, this to the
Yeah.
anti-vaccine movement. Look, infectious diseases really matter. People always say, oh, vaccines are the victims of their own success. That's why, and so if we had an outbreak here, people would see what was going on, and
Right.
this would be important. And and I'll fully admit I went along and said, well, it could very well be. Let's see what happens, and no, that didn't happen. What it gave was a sort of a new lease on life to the anti-vaccine movement, because now they moved into much of a broader market, I guess you could kind of say, if you want to think about it from a business standpoint. In that where they were already sort of having these interesting allies, I guess you could say. There was a lobbying group in California that was appearing at the State House that was aligned with, say, the Church of Scientology, for
Hmm.
example. There was a militia group that had shown up and expressed support. Now we saw them really moving into this realm of COVID disinformation and sort of pseudoscience as a
Hmm.
way to fight what they saw as government overreach. Well, and so
Hmm.
basically anything public health was doing. Well, public health is a government function, ergo anything public health does is government overreach. And so that got them, by the time we started to see the protests by around, I get the Michigan one, I guess, was around May, June,
Yeah.
somewhere around that. At least in California, we started to see them appearing and hoping to co-organize events at the state capitol that had a really, I'll say interesting, but you could say sort of curious range of bedfellows
Hmm.
that showed up as well. So it wasn't just anti-vaccine speakers. It was, in fact, if anything, they were just the MCs. They were people
That's
that
true.
had a very sort of Christian nationalist sort of orientation. So
Yeah.
people who believe that a Judeo-Christian, I mean, it's really a very heavily a Protestant Christian sort of orientation to the world and to morality and viewpoints. That should be the thing that sort of guides
Hmm.
government, and that should filter its way into how we run our nation and our state and local government. So we sort of that sort of perspective. So I mean, a good example of where that plays out of just beyond a worldview to actual real politic is that one person who they were allied with is this Christian nationalist-oriented pastor down here in Southern California, who was very much against the state imposing new sex education curriculum. And so trying to lead groups to push back because they didn't want their children to have to learn about transgender issues or
Right.
LGBT issues,
Right.
about sexuality and what. And they wanted to be able to teach their children whatever they wanted. So again, this kind of libertarian-ish kind of orientation. So we had that. We had people who were part of. We had some elected officials at the local level showing up who were very libertarian speakers. There
Yes.
were individuals very much of the natural rights movement. So these people that don't feel
Hmm.
they should be taxed or sorry, not natural rights, sorry, sovereign citizen. I always confuse the terminology. But this idea that the state that they are sort of their own entity and so therefore sort of free from taxation. We had even the one that really stands out to me, one of these big events. They were hyping their keynote speaker was coming up. And I'm like, oh boy, who could this be? All this stuff is posted on Facebook, and this is not any sort of like
Right.
in-depth sort of investigative journalism on my part. Is was an individual I'd never heard of because I just don't work in this space. Was someone that the Southern Poverty Law Center had been following. Has a national sort of speaker profile. A woman and her husband, although she is more prominent, and the name is escaping me, but who was known for very extremist types of views, very anti-government. And so this was really starting to show how now suddenly, I mean, at that point we had already seen, people being anti-lockdown. They were the mask stuff. I hadn't really fully heated up quite just yet at that point, but it was coming.
Okay.
Anti-contact tracing, basically everything that was coming down the pipe to deal with COVID,
Right.
they had an issue.
Right.
And you
Right.
can imagine contact tracing. Oh, government wants to surveil us and to keep tracks on
Right.
us, and and if we give them this, they'll take a yard, and also with this, we've seen to kind of also bring, I guess, sort of an end to this. To cap this off, is we now also see very much how this is. You'll see Trump flags at these events. You'll see alignment with militia type groups. This pastor I just mentioned shows up to events with state elected officials on the same stage, wearing a vest that has 3%er patches on it, or he hashtags the 3%er group, which is a known militia group that people were arrested at the Capitol, being affiliated with. And so, we're really starting to see this. But by the time it got to DC, we saw at least these individuals from California, we saw them on stage with a whole range of these types of individuals, including now Roger Stone and George Papadopoulos. And I mean, I can understand Stone. Papadopoulos was a little bit more of an interesting sort of person there, but then also Stuart Rhodes, who is the founder of the Promise Keepers. I'm always confusing.
Oath Keepers, Promise Keepers.
Oath Keepers. Yeah, I think Promise Keepers are the.
That's the other one.
That's a religious group.
Yeah, it is. I had to remember. Yeah, we got it.
And tied in with that, we also see a lot of, aside from the fact that they may be hanging out with local officials, much more of sort of a militia type tactics.
Yeah.
So the bullying, the doxing, hanging out and bragging that they are using militia type speak. We're boots on the ground. Public health is public health enemy number one.
Yeah.
And we get tips from militia groups, so bragging about that as sort of their that these are their pals.
Yeah.
And even a little bit of QAnon type dog whistling that appear, not necessarily by them per se, but we see it with other people that they share the stage with. So whenever you see things like an awful lot of strange talking suddenly about like child exploitation, and it seems to go on for an awful long time, you're kind of like, why are they on this subject? And you realize, okay, well, that's definitely a flag to QAnon,
right?
Because that's so tied into this worldwide government conspiracy of child sex exploitation, and obviously that's we should all be concerned about child exploitation.
No, we should.
But the way they use it in this way as this kind of cabal.
That's right. Yes, the cabal. These are all these keywords. It's interesting, the couple that I interviewed who were at the seat of that riot, who just heard that there was going to be a thing, they went to all of the protests because they just enjoy the public process. It's democracy in action. They had no idea, right? Who could have known? But one of the questions I asked Noelle was, did you notice that there were certainly many different factions, but did you notice that they were all comfortable hanging out together, right? So for example, you had people who were sort of in cosplay, right? The guy with the horns and the makeup standing next to like a school psychologist. Because I know in the past, anytime I've gone to something or just watched something that was sort of more peaceful protest related, I would notice sometimes that different factions would sort of be together, but not together in their own groups, but not all together. Because there was some discomfort, like, well, you're a little too radical. We want to make sure we're over here. But they were sharing with me that yes, that there were these just really interesting, all radicalized groups, but they were all very comfortable with each other. That she didn't notice that there were some who were like, well, I'm not going to scale the wall. That's your job. They were all in it together. And I wonder, I mean, look, I've been in politics forever. I've certainly had strong feelings about things. It just would never occur to me to be violent. or to break a window. Now, I'm not saying that makes me better or worse. Well, I mean, better from a legal perspective, I guess. But what drives some otherwise, whatever we define normal as, right? There was an
Right.
elementary school or middle school psychologist who was arrested. I mean, we're seeing some of the folks that have been arrested because, oh, by the way, in the background, as they're committing violent acts, they're taking selfies and they're videoing on iPhone as if they're kind of at this big sort of, I don't know, party event. Now, I think we can talk more about why, right? I think that we understand that some of these people really did believe that the president kind of had their back, as did the police. And that's what, and there's so many layers to this. But what, Richard, what does this look like when you have all these different factions? Within those factions, we're still going to say that they're on the more radical side. These are people who are willing
Yeah.
to participate in and incite violence. But Richard, what takes us to people who otherwise had nothing in their past that would have indicated no previous history of domestic violence, of fraud, of right? When you look at the history of people, there was just nothing there. And then all of a sudden they're on the steps of the Capitol armed or hanging out with people that are armed, and they're fully willing to storm the Capitol with this idea that we're here to cause harm.
Yeah.
What how do we get from here to here? What happens?
Yeah. Yeah, no, and yeah, exactly. I mean, well, certainly, right. I mean, there was the stoking of the event itself, right? That we did see that. Sort of, so I guess you could say working our way kind of backwards. I mean, the other thing is, storming the Capitol of all places, and really thinking that. I mean, what struck me looking at the video, especially the one that came out this weekend. I think it was this past weekend, with that had more extended sort of dialogue of what happened when they got into the Senate chambers.
Oh, right.
And so they really had in their head there was this. I mean, some of it is kind of I'll admit I look on it with a bit of pity, and
I know. Yeah.
kind of pathetic to think that, like, I mean, these people were really thinking they were playing soldier and they were going to discover, like, some big intel that was going to, as they were looking through stuff. So it really kind of does show this kind of mob kind of mentality. I mean, it's not to excuse any sort of. I think we can't just always look at this as sort of from the individual sort of psychology perspective, but also from the group phenomenon too. It doesn't excuse any sort of behavior with it, but we do see that. I do really wonder some of these people that went back home, and and then are. You could say, all right, they got found out, and so now they sound a little bit trying to be conciliatory or reconciliate, and throw themselves on the sword. No, I don't know why I did this and everything else, and cover themselves. And I do think that's there, and that could be a big driver of it. But I would not be surprised for some of these people too, that there was a little bit of after the fact of what did I do, even though they were fully
Yeah.
in support of the cause and everything.
Yeah.
I can't believe that I still went in and I did some stuff. That's not. I'm not excusing any of this away. It's disgusting
I
to
don't think
me,
you are. I mean, I
and I
think
hope they
I
do.
think,
There's
yeah,
consequences to doing it, and I hope the law
right,
does go after them. Um,
right.
but and I hope there's a full investigation in terms of what of all the everyone involved in inciting it too. But
But
so
I
go
think
ahead.
part of what you're touching on is the fact that the radicalization of so many millions of Americans, I think required, let's say, multiple factors, right? We do have the online misinformation silos.
Yes.
We now have actual news organizations such as OANN and Newsmax and others that are actually literally, they're not just partisan. That's different, right? People could say, well, CNN and MSNBC seem to be partisan, more left.
Yeah.
Fox News seems to be more right. But we're talking about news organizations who are actually spewing utter and complete lies. I mean, just
It's pure propaganda. Yeah.
it's
As
total
in the
propaganda.
colloquial sense of the word. Yeah.
And I think Fox News keeps swimming sort of in and out of that, because sometimes I'll hear some reasonable conversations, and then, last night Hannity was back talking about Hunter Biden's laptop, and I'm like, what
Yeah.
is happening? So if you are susceptible to, and susceptibility can be based on, again, kind of some of your background. Susceptibility can be, are you in a low information voter area, right? Where you just don't have access to news, or you don't have access to like good newspapers or good journalism. There's all those factors. And then
Yes.
again, social determinants associated with access to health. If you're not healthy and you're not mentally healthy, you're going to be susceptible to these things. So there's a whole bunch of factors that I'm sure that you could discuss
Yeah.
with us as to why that happens, which is why I think you're right, that I think there were people that actually went home and looked around their kitchen and their bedroom where it's like more normal and went, did I just do that?
Yeah.
Because it's what takes a human being from sort of, I get up every day and I brush my teeth and I do this, to I find myself on the Capitol just as invigorated and angry as everybody else.
Yeah.
But there's this place of sort of displaced and lack of reality. And suddenly you're standing on the Senate floor. And
Yeah.
that same night you're in your bedroom going, did I really do that? And I believe, to your point, it's not about excusing it, but it's about understanding. We have to have these discussions if we're going to acknowledge, how do people get radicalized? What leads people to violent behavior? And then the programming. I mean,
Yeah.
do we not need experts to literally deprogram? I mean, I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, I mean, so I think what you're highlighting too is the idea of that there's thought and how you move from kind of thought to action. And so it's one thing to believe lots of different things, that you're the QAnon person, or you're the hardcore Trumpist, or whatever. It's another thing to get on a plane. I mean, even then, I mean, we could even kind of say, all right, great, our nation enables freedom of assembly, right to protest. I may not agree with it. I may not see the reasoning behind, the argument behind, your claims that the vote count was all wrong.
Right.
But all right, that's our nation, and vive la difference, and let's have
Yeah.
it. But then when
Right.
it turns to violence, of course, then you think to yourself, what, my goodness, and then so how do we move from those sorts of progressions with it? But I think there's a number of different things going on here. I mean, one is um, the echo chamber. I mean, we live in a very, very polarized society right now in terms of our information channels, in terms of the types of people that we hang out with, and we share ideas with. Social media makes that much easier to do.
Yeah.
And stay
Right.
connected, particularly within and now, the other thing is, probably in some ways it could have been even worse, in the sense that, we've been home, things have been closed. Um, if you're living in a location that perhaps has lower COVID numbers, you might not have had somebody who's been so affected by it. Well, then that case, I mean, nowadays that would be much harder. But there's still very much this narrative going around by a certain subgroup of Americans that COVID's no big deal. Why are we doing this? I've been shut down. I'm a business owner. Here's where we've seen in California, anti-vax movement kind of getting inroads and getting allies, is because
Right.
people who are vulnerable, they don't understand why the state won't do these things, and people telling them, you're a victim. This is a problem. This is your government. And so people, in some ways, it kind of subverts their belief system or their loyalty to a country. And so you're creating this kind of uh, um, personal kind of conflict, I guess you could say, you're coming to terms with, here's something that I very much believe in, and it's something that seems to be working against me. Now, I mean, there's also lots of, I'm not the expert on this area. There's lots of other sociologists who study this and know this stuff a lot better than I do. But, there's also issues around of what we've seen over just the past few years of just, I mean, with obviously Trump politics, but also just this kind of sentiment or reaction and concern about the fact that America is changing, and America is changing rather quickly, and that's very disconcerting to certain individuals. I mean, let's call it for what it is. If you look at that gathering, heavily male, heavily nearly all white.
Yeah.
And this is very, I should say nearly all white, but for the most part, pretty much very, very heavily. We can see much a reaction to what's viewed as sort of a this now new recognition of that America is diverse and needs to be recognizing and celebrating that diversity in a different way, and that white America, middle America, is not the this dominant political group. And then so you can really see this kind of threat perspective that's been fueled, and I mean, certainly the Trump administration and even the campaign really tried to play up, and a bit of a backlash in after 8 years of the Obama administration too. And so that's not it's not. I don't believe that racism drives it all, but there's other elements of seeing things and just being of feeling threatened and of hearing things. We're being invaded by Mexican
I agree.
immigrants.
And part of what worries me is that there is, we know that a lot of rage and anger, the underpinning of that is fear. I mean, it was just, we know
Absolutely.
this to be true. And so
Yeah.
when I also saw, again, predominantly male, predominantly white, and no white men, I'm not saying you're the fault of everything. It's not, everything is not your problem. I know
Yeah.
that's not really the point here.
I don't
But
feel
when you,
personally triggered.
I'm not, but I think the rage that we saw and the yelling that we saw and the sincere, because there was fear and rage at the same time. But again, some of that is that radicalized messaging, especially part of what we heard was, Joe Biden is going to turn us into this socialist state. And it's like, that's just not true. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just not, but you know what? Time will tell. It's not unlike what happened to a lot of QAnon believers and supporters the day
Yeah.
after the election, right? And all of the, wait, this didn't happen. Wait, all of these Democrats weren't arrested. Wait, they got sworn in. I mean, right. So there are a lot of people, as you know, that are leaving social platforms that were sort of with that QAnon messaging that are taking off because nothing that they said was going to happen happened. And the whole fear of everything, it didn't happen. So time is going to sort of, I think, tell for many of these people when they can start to see things that happen moving forward. Richard,
But there's a market for fear. I think
there
really
is a
that's
market
how we
for
have to
fear.
think about this. And
Well,
so
look,
there is
national news does a great job with that, right? I mean, that's
right.
what gets you clicks and hits and views. It just
Yes.
does.
Yes. And I mean, we can blame them. We can blame mainstream news just as much as we can these kinds of fringe groups. But clearly, if
Right.
there's Newsmax and there's OAN, there's clearly a market for that kind of
Mhm.
for that kind of fear peddling. We see with the anti-vax movement. We've seen how the anti-vax movement and certain leaders of it have very nicely. I joke it's kind of like you remember Mad Libs
Oh,
when
sure.
kids, you fill in the words but everything is sort of stock otherwise. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
it's sort of the same thing, but remove vaccines and start to put in stuff about COVID, and we start to see sort of a
Mm,
very nice transition. And the same thing with we this is sort of these new. There's clearly a market for these. For this kind of fear, and it works and spans across a number of different issues. People who can't open their businesses and make a
yeah.
living, and in that respect, ironically, that would one would think that that would be a point to kind of say, well, why isn't the government kind of doing enough in
Yeah.
terms of trying to provide support and aid? But instead, it's viewed much more as again, it's all about how you frame it. And these businesses and individuals it's very easy to now say, hey, look, it's the state. It's well
Yeah.
in California. I mean, like Newsom gets however anyone feels about it in sort of a mainstream sort of discourse around his administration. But in these kinds of fringe circles, I mean, he is painted as like the devil incarnate. And it's this kind of
Yes.
like symbol of everything that's kind of bad in the world. And so
Yes.
you can just focus and make things personal and make the objects of things kind of human and
Yeah.
tangible
Yeah.
versus these just circling things that are out there. So
Well, and I
whether it
think that
be
bumps into, I'm sorry, please finish your thought.
oh, I was going to say whether it be gangs coming up from the Mexican border,
Mhm.
terrorists that could be coming in from the outside, super liberal professors on college campuses that these people have not probably stepped a foot on a college campus in maybe in how many years, if ever, and don't know anything
Right.
better on it. I mean, I guess that's a whole other podcast we could have. But
Yeah, it is. Yes, it is.
but these constant sorts of narratives, but when I said about mainstream news, I mean it's not just OAN and Newsmax and what you're getting on YouTube. That's I mean, I get these too because I follow
Yeah.
a lot of this news, and so I get that kind of programming that comes to me as well. Watch this source or go to these. These are groups that I would never for my own
Right.
politics, but you can see how it's very easily gets in that echo chamber. You have friends and family of sort of the similar thing, and to be able to share information on what we know that online is where a good percentage of where people get their news
That's right.
through social media. And so when it's getting delivered by a friend, someone that you trust, someone who has the same sort of viewpoints as you too, we can see where this just kind of circles and
Yes.
creates this like ecosystem
Yeah.
of ideology. And then of course tie that in with Trump and this sort of cult of personality around
Yeah.
this charismatic figure, authoritative, who's going to shake things up, and you certainly have this recipe for all these different problems. But the problem is behind the man itself, you had all these other sorts of players who knew how to stoke that
Yeah,
sort of
that's right.
stuff. So if
That's
you think
right.
about the Roger Stones and you think about the Steve Bannons, and so again, that fear mongering thing, I think, is a very important element of it, such that. And one more point I just want to add to this is this really struck me. I mean, I was already thinking about this, but I think where it really really forced me to kind of take a step back and go, wow, there it is. If I had to pick like one little clip, watch Lou Correa, Congressperson
Oh,
Lou Correa's
yeah.
video when he was accosted in the DC airport by very heavy Trump loyalists who were in DC.
Yes.
And what struck me there is, and I think what people should pay attention to is how there wasn't dialogue being thrown at him. We don't like you
Hmm.
because you do this, this, and that, and in some sort of
Hmm.
extended argument sort of thing that we would think about reasonable people would kind of engage in. It was simply buzzword throwing,
Right.
name calling with buzzwords. You're a socialist.
Yeah.
You are. What about those? I forget what about those Dominion voting machines? It
Right.
was just these like,
Yes.
just that were these like package deal,
Yes.
vague things that
Yes.
honestly, I think if you quizzed, I mean, if you quiz some of these people, what is the definition of socialism? That they might be all over the place and what their answer is. Um, those socialist Democrats, right? And so we really see here about now, again, it's not just where did that come from? And we see really where political discourse and framing has very much packaged these ideas into these terms, and then the labels that come with them really just become these stigmas to kind of throw at people.
Yeah.
And put on people, the scarlet letter, socialist, and in some cases, we see this on the left too. I see things like globalist, and or sorry,
Yeah.
globalist tends to be a right one, but I've seen this also sort of getting thrown out
Mm.
on the left too, with the Bernie Bros and stuff like that.
Right.
But clearly, we see for this extremist kind of problem of recent weeks, definitely where that is really manifesting itself in these kinds of very concerning sorts of ways. And so you think about what's public discourse then, if everything is just tied into these
Right.
these words, right?
Right. And the very thing we talked about relative to public health officials being stalked and people, violent people who were doxing them on social media. I know the names of your kids. I'm going to come get you. Dr. Pan was actually physically accosted
Yeah.
during the time that his bill was there, that was on video. But now we're moving
Well,
into
even in two
elected
weeks
officials.
ago, I'm
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you, but
No, please.
we've now see it with. So they were State House. They were debating a bill. I believe it was something related to vaccine rollout or COVID response, and people showed up for public comment. And
Yeah.
even in there was these. I'm not even sure if they identified as being part of a particular group,
Uh-huh.
but the clips that were at least shown were these were people that were hinting at, and not hinting such that you would want to take it seriously, particularly in recent weeks, but
Hmm.
hinting at violence would be coming if they didn't
Yeah.
get their. And
Yeah.
this were not the white cosplaying dudes that we saw at the
Right.
Capitol. These were
Right.
women even, and so we
Yeah.
really see how this is really permeated. It's across the nation. It doesn't just get these extremists who could get on a plane and go to DC, but we see it as that there's probably lots of other people who stayed home that
Right.
we also have to be thinking about in terms of what's the prevalence of this problem.
And violence, I mean, this is the big concern for me. I mean, once upon a time, there was a bill in the state capitol. And if you had the time and the space and you were aware, you might go there and you might want to, pull a number and have the ability to go address that particular committee on a piece of legislation that you were either for or against. And that was our process, right? We had conversations and maybe we
Right,
even got a little mad, but we discussed it.
right,
And then there was a result.
yeah,
And you might leave frustrated, but there was a result.
yeah. It's a
Now
beautiful Norman
violence,
Rockwell painting
that's
about
what
that.
sure feels like it now. But now there's almost this acceptance of violence as a method of moving either public opinion or changing minds in the space of politics. And even Mitt Romney, we saw that video go, viral when he was in the airport and people came up and started yelling at him. Then people got on the plane and were chanting on the plane during the flight,
Yeah,
holding up their so are we moving towards safety is going to be an issue now for anyone who has an opinion about anything. Is that, I mean, are we moving that? It looks like we're moving in that direction right now. And where are we going?
Yeah. No, unfortunately, I think we are going that way. I mean, it's clear that, I mean, this is where we start with the anti-vaccine movement back, before COVID, is this idea: show up at state houses and yell over people, and use these kinds of
That's
scare
right.
tactics. And I mean, I'm an academic, and I get it from people either online, or I get emails
Right.
yelling at me, or throwing, got one the other day, called me a dago. I haven't been called a dago in years. I didn't even know that was still a slur for
Wow.
Italian Americans.
I
Yeah,
haven't
and
heard
so
that word in a long time.
I mean,
Okay.
yeah, but all these things that you do still, you still have to take them seriously, and and
Right.
report to police, and other things. So there is this, and I'm a guy. I mean, I know for a lot of my female colleagues online, there's get it far worse than I do, even that there is definitely these
Right.
intimidation type tactics
Right.
for ideas that you just don't agree with. Um,
Right.
and I just think some of it is tied to, I think, how the targets have been vilified in particular kinds of ways. So
Mm-hmm.
of course, lawmakers, there's a lot at stake there,
Mm-hmm.
and but certainly experts in general, as we've seen with the pandemic, academics, certainly, that we're all sort of, I guess, these like sort of radical lefties, who are corrupting America's youth, and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
But Jeff, sort of a broader. I mean, I guess we could say it gets into this sort of broader anti-intellectualism,
Mm-hmm.
anti-expert
Right.
discussion too. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, it is very much it is very concerning, and I have an opinion, and I should be heard,
Mm-hmm.
as well as, so there's that. So there's sort of this, like, I want to be heard, and I'm going to shout really loud. So even if I
Mm-hmm.
don't have an idea on something, the louder I hear, I yell it, and I will threaten you. I
Yeah.
might even go to threatening with you with it. I There is also this sort of, shucks. Now I had the other ones that were tied into this, but uh, this sort of sort of anything that's sort of intellectual, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And I don't mean intellectual as, that somebody's a rocket science, but just this idea, whether it be an auto mechanic or an accountant.
Can we say critical thinking? Can we just say critical
Yeah,
thinking?
critical thinking, yeah, is sort of this seeing knowledge, or having a knowledge base, as being elite, and somebody
Mm-hmm.
then using it, and me saying,
Yes.
something like, no, I'm sorry, like, I've gone to school for years on this, and that we know
Right.
that just doesn't hold up. Oh, well,
Right.
you're just an elitist. This, well, no, that's
Right.
not really how that works. And
Right.
these are the same people that I really doubt would get in the cockpit of the 747, and start to, second guess what the pilot is doing, but yet at the same time, for all other
Right.
sorts of things, they're experts on it, right?
Right.
And we could say social media probably doesn't help with that, in the sense that it makes things now more accessible, and it's easier to opine about stuff. But also,
Absolutely.
a general kind of lack of understanding about civics, and really how government
Yes.
works, and understanding
Absolutely.
concepts. Yeah,
I have
that
heard
too.
some unbelievable things about, and just about the lack of people understanding that the reason why we know this election was safe,
Right.
understanding that there is always some level of fraud in elections. There just
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Fraud can comprise somebody got two ballots and used
Yeah.
both of them.
Yeah.
Somebody who had passed away, somebody voted for them. There's
Right.
always some level of fraud. That's normal.
Right. Yeah.
But the
Absolutely.
amount of recounts, the amount of certifications, people of Trump's own party coming out and saying, no, really, we've certified our vote. If we don't have an informed electorate as to how our elections work, the process,
Yeah.
then we're combating. We're trying to combat people who don't even seem to be very interested in the truth or interested in how our elections actually work. And that's hard. That's hard.
Yes.
Where do we go from there from
Right.
a conversation? If you don't even want to have a conversation with me, and I am concerned. I mean, Richard, I don't know about you, but certainly Facebook seems to be even worse for me. But people that I know,
Yeah.
that I'm connected to, we've raised kids together, whatever, are absolutely convinced of a series of things that really worry me. I mean, that
Right.
worry me that otherwise you're not a low information voter. You're not all those. You may have a degree. I mean, all those sort of determinants that are sort of easy to say, well, this is why. It's not that easy. It's not
Right.
that easy. And so you and I could talk about this for, I'm sure, 5 or 6 hours.
Yeah.
But wrapping it up, because I promised you after the election there was going to be a ton of things I wanted to talk to you about. But when we talk about wrapping up this moment, which is, we know that the anti-vaccine movement is a movement. We are worried about those vaccine hesitant parents. So messaging around science and communications, public health matters. You and I have had several conversations about that. But now we see sort of, again, some of those more radicalized groups, which comprise everything from anti-vaccine to overall anti-government, lack of trust and expertise. It's all of these different factions. But moving forward, do you have some thoughts as we wrap up as to ways that we can begin to sort of peck away at some of these factors that tend to be the underpinnings of why someone has the ability to go sort of more radical and not be thinking anymore? What can we do, right? I mean, as your education, K through 12, what are some things that you would, I mean, for you guys are a professor and certainly your areas of expertise, what are some things that policymakers can start to think about to begin to, it'll be slow, but at least start? What are some of those things that you would recommend?
Well, I think first and foremost, we need to get back to a little bit of normality in governments in government when we think about at the federal level, and that's not a, and I don't say this as I really don't like swooning over candidates when people come in about
Yeah,
stuff. I'm a very skeptical, very detached kind of view of politics as it's something that's there, and we analyze it and we think about people as sort of these. I guess I think about it like a political scientist would try to do of that these are actors
right.
and operating in different ways to pursue different ends, and we should be able to take a step back and look at that sort of critically with it. But I will say that I do I'm hopeful. I'm hardened by the Biden administration's sort of real push that this is going to be, that science is going to be back to the forefront about things, that we're going to be
Mhm.
using sort of or at least if nothing else, at least have the sign of it that there's going to be some sort of role of reason and informed expertise that's going to be guiding decision making and policy making, even if there's things that me or you or somebody else doesn't agree with. That
Mhm.
there's at least some sort of sound argument to it versus
Mhm.
just some sort of pure ideology or
Right.
it feels good, and that we'll see some sort of reason behind it. So I'm very hardened with that. This is going to take time. We're not going to fix it in a long time, but I do think all these sorts of little things start to add up and start to create a certain sort of culture where we can come to expect things again. And so this, again, this is not me like endorsing a particular sort of political party. I mean, these are things that are going back to, that we saw in other administrations. For however one might feel about, whether, the Reagan administration did this or the Bush, or the Obama administration was so great or bad about something else. But to the idea of bringing it back to a certain sort of baseline, whereas now it's been where we've seen over 4 years a very different sort of communication style. Um, this poisoning of the well, unfortunately, we've had 4 years of that, where essentially anything that seems to be sort of based on some sort of expertise or reason gets sort of
Right.
trashed if it's immediately within if it's something is counter to it, I mean, that's been incredibly toxic, and that's really in many respects why we see many of the issues that we have now. All you got to do is cast doubt on something, cast trust in the
Yeah. Right.
process, suspicion, and there you go. And so I really think now having the science advisor being part of being a cabinet level position, I think that says a lot.
Mhm.
To the average citizen, I don't think that means as much, but it's going to be, so much of this is going to be about PR and
Yeah.
really about
Yeah.
Biden assembling a committee, a COVID task force, for, days after the election. Uh,
Mhm.
I hope everything works out well, and I hope, but at least, no matter who's in office, that's what we would expect, and that's what we need.
Yeah.
And
That's right. That's right. That's
so,
right.
I
Yeah.
think, essentially, I think what I'm kind of getting at, not realizing it, is this idea of where we also need to be trying to take some idea, many of our ideas and hard thinking and expertise, out of away from the sort of taint that it has, that
Yeah.
knowledge is red or blue on certain things.
Yeah. Right.
I
Right.
mean, I'm not naive to think that, in policy and with science, there's always going to be some sort of biases that are going to creep into things.
Sure.
But to the extent to which it is, it's not been helpful, and now we need to be moving back and basically resetting the dial. And I think that's
Right.
what's going to be really important here. I
No,
do
I
like,
think in one
the
of
other
the
one too is there's a sociologist who was appointed also as a science and technology, or sort of a science and society sort of advisor, just under the science advisor, the president, Alondra Nelson, who I think that's going to be a fantastic sort of role here, because it's not just so much about expertise, but I also think that we've also have this sort of we've moved over the years, and maybe in some ways we could say, all right, maybe this got amplified in the Trump administration, but I think in general this is sort of more of our culture in general, that we do have this viewpoint that technology will save us from everything. It will fix everything. We could have a TED talk on it, and here's like the panacea of whatever problem ails us. And we don't really, so we tend to look to Silicon Valley and what can a programmer do and all these other things, and not realizing that there are science or societal impacts of technology. There are also societal values that we have, and interests that drive certain sorts of technology too. And so we really do need to be thinking about really, where that's sort of basically sort of a management, I guess you could say, or at least having important discussions about
Mhm.
where technology can kind of lead us and how we can use it most effectively to address the problems that we have, versus just throwing up our hands and saying, like a vaccine's going to save us, for example. Oh, that'll be the thing. Well, there's lots of other things that we could have been implementing and doing it better. As like,
Yeah.
for example, New Zealand showed us, and and some other nations. That doesn't mean like we had to do full government over control of things. As immediately that would be where the people would go with that. But again, the vaccine will save us. And then, okay, now it gets developed. We've got two, we got more on the way, hopefully, and or it seems to be. And now, okay, but we still are faced with the social problems of rollout and, and hesitancy and
That's
other
right.
sorts of situations. And so
That's
again,
right.
the tech is not enough.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not. And I do think that the misinformation campaigns that have been proactively coming at us for the last 4 years have been a significant part of why we are in such a dramatic position. But I do know, and what I'm heartened by is that when government starts to work again and people don't feel like they have to pay attention, most people should not actually be able to name like everybody in government,
Yeah.
and that's largely because it means that it's working, right? So
Right.
I think that when the government starts to work again, and we sort of lower the temperature a little bit, I think that we're going to see some improvements across the board. But I know that I want to have more conversations with you because there is so much going on, and there's so many things I think are worthy of talking about and contextualizing and relaxing about and trusting. And here's where the experts are, and it's okay to trust them.
Yeah.
Here's why they're called experts. So I think
Yeah,
I
I mean,
think we have
one quick example to that is, amidst all when the election fraud stuff was just starting out with that,
right.
I guess, there was lots of people that, of course, were going to tune into the people that might be saying the things that they might want to say. My reaction to it was thinking on Twitter, oh, wow, this is a person here who has studied election fraud for years and is an expert and knows how voting machines work. I want to follow that person because I want to see what their take is on it.
Right.
Like, so that's uh, I'm not saying that I had the, and I'm the right solution on everything, but in that case, it is amazing how we kind of, it's easy to circle the wagons and just go into your bubble, or you can do things that could challenge you and find out more about this and get to the
That's right.
bottom of it. I want to be an informed citizen.
That's right. Well, and I researched you before I reached out to you on Twitter that day.
Right.
Okay, so he does public policy and sociology, but I've seen him on Twitter talking about this. What's his expertise? And I thought, boom, this is really fascinating. He's got expertise in public health and medical. I mean, that's why though, right? It was because of your expertise. So
Thanks.
I think we're going to see, I do think we're going to see a slow build back towards the seeking of expertise, and then expertise being lifted up again in
Right.
messaging in the federal government that will trickle down. Our challenges aren't going to go away. We have a lot to face, but I think now that if we can start having more intelligent conversations seems that we've got a president and an administration with cabinet experts who are really ready to hit the ground running and start to sort of right some of these ships that we must. I think we have, COVID is we have to get this virus under control, get people vaccinated. Happily, most people are pro-vaccine. And I think that, while we may have some challenges, I think 2021 is going to be a brighter day for a variety of reasons. So
restoring credibility of our institutions is going to be still going to be very key too.
Absolutely.
Deep. I shouldn't say deep state because then we're going to be playing into the
I'm so that word. I know.
Yeah. But when we think about things like, again, those organizations that nobody, we just assume they operate in the background and, we trust them or whatnot. I mean, so we've got to restore the CDC's credibility.
Yes.
We need to be restoring the National Oceanography and Atmospheric Administration. We shouldn't be doing Sharpie Gate. Those are, they provide all the data that when we go to AccuWeather and all these other places, so clearly that's expertise, that you would think why would you ever undermine that? Obviously the EPA is always this kind of battleground, but instilling and bringing that back in terms of science credibility. The FDA has been under attack, so that it's going to be this, it's not just going to be about personalities, but it's also going to be very much about these. I mean, it's going to be important to get good leaders in them to clean up things and restore images, but and then we're also, in terms of the global level, I think we've done some good work to undermine the credibility of the World Health Organization, and I think we have to do a job to now help to build some of that back up again. I mean, lots of other countries perhaps that's not the case, and maybe that in some cases would be shaking their heads at us on that, but nevertheless, whatever mess that we've caused or damage, I think we now have to fix that.
Right. No, and
they
I think
need us and we need them.
That's right. That's right. And I think that we're
not an island.
See that. No, we're not. No, we're not. Much as we'd like to think we are. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me. This is so much fun. It's always
fun. I
fun.
love our conversations. I could talk to you for hours. I just appreciate it.
How much time you got? I'm good.
Well, we will again. I think I have a whole series of topics that I want to talk to you about, and we just can't pack it into one conversation, although I believe we could, but I don't think anybody wants to sit through that. So in the meantime, Dr. Carpiano, thank you again for a wonderful conversation. Thank you for your expertise. Thanks for your sense of humor and your approach to all of this. I think 2021 is I think we're going to see a brighter day ahead. And I know that it feels good now. I'm breathing now. I feel like I'm breathing. I feel like we're heading in the right direction.
Great. Yeah. Gosh.
Thank you.
Here's hoping, right? it's a long road, and there's going to be there's going to be lots of hurdles ahead, but onward and upward, and we're one way or another, however people feel, we're turning a new leaf, and so it's
I totally agree. Well, thank you. I will look forward to talking to you again soon.
Likewise.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks.